In the mesmerizing blue expanse of the Caribbean Sea lies a 70-acre island known as Little St. James, not cloaked by the mysteries of nature, but by the horrifying legacy of what occurred there. Purchased in 1998 by Jeffrey Epstein, a man whose wealth was rivaled only by the obscurity surrounding its origins, the island would transform into something far more sinister than a private retreat. It became a monument to exploitation, a fortress where innocence was not merely lost but forcefully stripped away. Surrounded by palm-lined shores and hidden coves, this secluded paradise evolved into a secretive enclave, far from public scrutiny, where some of the world's most powerful individuals allegedly congregated. The means of arrival? Epstein's private Boeing 727, ominously nicknamed the Lolita Express, a flying symbol of elite privilege and dark indulgence. Those who boarded this jet belonged to the upper echelons of global power, fame, and influence, men whose reputations could not shield them from the weight of association. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon of Little St. James, the island's long shadows whispered what the walls refused to say aloud. The silence here was not peaceful, it was oppressive. The cries of the young, the unheard pleas for help, seemed to linger in the air, trapped within the marble corridors and manicured pathways of Epstein's palatial estate. This was not a sanctuary. It was a stage upon which one of the most disturbing acts in modern history would unfold. Behind the gates and beneath the surface of luxury, darker forces thrived. The arrest of Jeffrey Epstein in July 2019 seemed, at last, to signal a reckoning. Yet, with his sudden death just a month later in a Manhattan jail cell, what should have been a path to justice instead became a labyrinth of unanswered questions. Who orchestrated this network of secrecy and power? What exactly happened behind the closed doors of this island, in the rooms of opulent mansions and aboard flights that touched down in places away from prying eyes? To understand this web of darkness, we must proceed with the insight of French writer Honoré de Balzac, who once wrote, "Behind every great fortune lies a great crime." This chilling truth urges us to examine not just Epstein's wealth, but the deeply rooted corruption and complicity it may have masked. Are you prepared to confront what lies beneath the surface of prestige and opulence? Are you ready to explore the shadows of Little St. James and the secrets carried in the sky by the Lolita Express? This is not just the story of a man. It is a descent into a world where influence meets silence and power protects the unspeakable. Welcome to the beginning of that descent. In the dense weave of modern society's upper crust, few life stories begin in such stark contrast to where they ultimately lead as that of Jeffrey Epstein. Born on January 20th, 1953, in the bustling borough of Brooklyn, New York, Epstein was raised amid the grit and dreams of post-war America. His parents, Seymour and Pauline Epstein, embodied the working-class ethos, Seymour serving the city through the Parks and Recreation Department, and Pauline grounding the home with the quiet labor of motherhood. Their modest residence in Coney Island stood in a world of contradiction, a neighborhood alive with the cheerful shrieks of roller coasters and arcade games, yet also weighed down by urban decay and socio-economic struggle. It was here, in this paradox of wonder and hardship, that Epstein's early life took root. Epstein's academic brilliance began to shine during his time at Lafayette High School, located in the heart of Brooklyn. His teachers noted his extraordinary aptitude in mathematics. His thought processes were methodical, abstract, and imaginative all at once. He didn't just solve problems, he dissected them, peered inside, and rebuilt them in his mind. His talent wasn't just raw intelligence, it was persistence. He graduated at the age of 16, already carving out a path unlike those of his peers. As Einstein once remarked, "It's not that I'm so smart, it's just that I stay with problems longer." Epstein, it seemed, lived by that principle. His academic journey led him first to Cooper Union, a school known for its intellectual rigor. However, his time there was brief, another stepping stone rather than a final destination. He soon transferred to the Current Institute of Mathematical Sciences at New York University, a place where elite mathematical minds gathered to understand the universe through numbers. Yet, once again, Epstein took an unconventional turn. He left without obtaining a degree, No diploma, no ceremony, only questions. It was a choice that raised eyebrows but also cemented his reputation as a man not bound by conventional paths. Like the Robert Frost line he seemed to embody, he took the road less traveled by, and it would indeed make all the difference. Then, in a curious twist, Epstein entered the world of education. In the early 1970s, he began teaching physics and mathematics at the prestigious Dalton School on Manhattan's Upper East Side, despite lacking formal teaching credentials. His hiring raised murmurs, but his intellect made an impression. Students found him magnetic, if unconventional. His classroom was not a place for rote memorization, but rather for provocative questions and intense discussion. He didn't teach by the book. He taught from somewhere deeper. Epstein's presence at Dalton wasn't just that of a teacher. It was something more elusive, a blend of charisma, control, and mystique that many would later recognize as his defining social weapon. Yet even here, in a place dedicated to knowledge and shaping young minds, whispers began to swirl, of behaviors that didn't quite fit, of boundaries stretched too thin. These early years formed the jagged edges of Epstein's public persona, intellectually gifted, socially fluid, and personally opaque. From the carnival echoes of Coney Island to the hushed corridors of elite academic institutions, his story had always been a study in contradiction. He was brilliant, yet evasive, ambitious, yet secretive. Each step forward was paired with a murky shadow. As his narrative unfolded, it became clear that these formative experiences weren't isolated chapters. They were the blueprint of a man who would defy norms, manipulate systems, and walk paths where others dared not tread. In The Cutthroat, World of Wall Street, where fortunes are won and lost in the blink of an eye, Jeffrey Epstein's entry was anything but traditional. His rise, however, was nothing short of meteoric. Without a college degree and lacking the polished pedigree common among high-finance elites, Epstein managed to insert himself into the upper echelons of America's financial machine. In the late 1970s, he joined Bear Stearns, one of the era's most aggressive investment banks. Almost instantly, Epstein's analytical genius stood out. He had a preternatural ability to decipher complex financial instruments, an instinct for patterns, and a knack for earning trust in high-stakes environments. His coworkers described him as intense, charismatic, and relentlessly focused. By 1980, in just a few years, he had achieved the coveted position of limited partner, a role reserved for the most exceptional talent. It was a title that signified not just success but deep influence. As the old Rothschild adage goes, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws." It was a philosophy Epstein seemed to understand well as he moved ever closer to the inner circles of power and wealth. Yet just as quickly as he ascended, Epstein departed. In 1981, under still mysterious circumstances, he left Bear Stearns. What he took with him was not just insider knowledge of the financial system, but also the confidence, contacts, and cunning to navigate it alone. That same year, he launched his own firm, Intercontinental Assets Group, Inc., based in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The company specialized in recovering stolen or hidden wealth, a role that placed Epstein in the shadows between legality and secrecy. Epstein's work at Intercontinental painted him as a kind of financial bounty hunter, part investigator, part fixer. He moved silently through the financial underworld, finding and extracting money for clients whose wealth had vanished into the cracks of global markets. He operated in a realm few understood and fewer dared to enter. Publicity was avoided, and discretion was the currency. One of the most curious turns in Epstein's career came with his involvement in Towers Financial Corporation, led by Stephen Hoffenberg. Though his role was brief and his direct culpability unproven, the company would later be exposed as the architect of a massive Ponzi scheme, one that defrauded investors of more than $450 million. Hoffenberg, who was later convicted, called Epstein the architect behind some of the company's most complex operations, though Epstein was never formally charged. Whether he stood just outside the fire or quietly stoked the flames remains a matter of speculation. But it was in the mid-1980s that Epstein unveiled his true financial masterpiece, the formation of J. Epstein and Company, later rebranded as Financial Trust Company. This was no ordinary investment firm. Based in the U.S. Virgin Islands, it catered exclusively to clients with assets of $1 billion or more. This wasn't just a wealth management group. It was an invitation-only club for the ultra-elite. The firm's operations were shrouded in secrecy. No public advertising, no detailed records. The client list was locked tighter than any vault. Among the few known names was Leslie Wexner, the billionaire retail magnate behind brands like Victoria's Secret. Wexner's deep trust in Epstein went far beyond the typical financial advisor-client relationship, culminating in the mysterious transfer of a multi-million-dollar New York mansion into Epstein's name. Such transactions hinted at a deeper level of control and influence. Epstein wasn't just managing money. He was managing people, positioning himself as a silent broker of power among the world's wealthiest. Operating from the financial shelter of the Virgin Islands, Epstein offered something few others could: total discretion. In a world increasingly governed by regulation and oversight, he created a sanctuary for the financial elite, one where questions were discouraged and privacy was paramount. Epstein's business was less about balance sheets and more about access. Access to capital, access to people, access to secrets. In many ways, he was less a financier and more a strategist, conducting a symphony of wealth, power, and manipulation from behind the curtain. His financial empire was a masterpiece of opacity. As Warren Buffett once said, "Risk comes from not knowing what you're doing." But in Epstein's case, the real risk may have been that he knew exactly what he was doing and made sure no one else did. As his influence grew, so too did the ice fog surrounding him. Where his money came from, how it grew, and who truly benefited became riddles without answers. His ascent in the financial labyrinth wasn't just remarkable, it was nearly impenetrable. And perhaps that was exactly how he planned it. Jeffrey Epstein's legacy cannot be understood through financial records alone. His influence extended far beyond balance sheets and asset portfolios. It bled into the highest echelons of politics, science, academia, and entertainment. Epstein was not merely a wealthy financier. He was a calculated architect of relationships, carefully weaving a complex web of connections that granted him access to global power. Among the most scrutinized of his associations was his link to former U.S. President Bill Clinton. From 2001 to 2003, Clinton reportedly took over 24 flights aboard Epstein's private jet, the infamous Lolita Express. While these trips were officially framed around philanthropic efforts and speaking engagements, their frequency and secrecy raised serious questions in the public eye. The connection blurred lines between diplomacy and scandal, igniting widespread speculation about what else might have transpired. On the opposite end of the political spectrum stood Donald Trump, who shared a similarly notable, though now disavowed, relationship with Epstein. Photographs and accounts from Mar-a-Lago, Trump's luxurious resort in Palm Beach, captured moments of camaraderie between the two. Social events, laughter, mutual acquaintances. Later, Trump would distance himself publicly, stating he was not a fan. But the echoes of their past interactions remained difficult to silence. Epstein didn't limit his reach to political figures. He extended his patronage and companionship into the world of science and academia, where his influence grew in parallel with his donations. Names like Lawrence Krauss, a prominent physicist, and others from prestigious institutions such as Harvard found themselves drawn into Epstein's gravitational pull. Millions of dollars flowed into university programs and research labs, particularly at Harvard University, which received funding for programs in evolutionary dynamics and interdisciplinary studies. These donations, however, would later trigger serious ethical debates. As more details of Epstein's criminal allegations surfaced, institutions once proud of his support found themselves re-evaluating their acceptance of his funds. Some considered returning the money, others faced internal reckoning about the morality of financial ties to a man now synonymous with abuse and exploitation. Epstein's involvement in education and philanthropy seemed strategic, positioning himself as a gatekeeper of intellectual prestige. But as Aristotle once said, to give away money is an easy matter, but to decide to whom to give it and how large and when, and for what purpose and how, is neither in every man's power nor an easy matter. In hindsight, Epstein's generosity appeared less about uplifting others and more about embedding himself within the world's most influential circles. His bond with billionaire Leslie Wexner, founder of L Brands and the architect behind Victoria's Secret, was perhaps the most revealing. Wexner didn't just trust Epstein with financial matters. He handed over control of a New York mansion valued at tens of millions. It was an extraordinary gesture, one that hinted at a level of intimacy and authority rarely granted to financial advisors. Yet years later, Wexner would sever ties and claim that Epstein had misappropriated vast sums of money. Their once powerful alliance ended in scandal and silence. The entertainment world, too, played host to Epstein's complex network. His homes, particularly the Manhattan Mansion and Little St. James Island, were the backdrops for gatherings that blended celebrity glamour with intellectual spectacle. Artists, actors, tech moguls, scientists, and politicians intermingled at soirees that now carry an air of dread. What seemed glamorous at the time would later be viewed as sinister. The opulence, the art, the carefully curated guest lists, all of it masked a darker reality. It was a world where appearances mattered more than truth. A world where wealth insulated actions from consequences, at least for a while. Epstein's ability to charm, manipulate, and embed himself within circles of influence was no accident. He was strategic, methodical, and relentless in his pursuit of proximity to power. And as time revealed, many of those connections, once symbols of status, would become burdens of shame. In the words of Oscar Wilde, "In every first-rate novel, the real hero is the man you do not see." In Epstein's world, he was both, the invisible orchestrator and the living contradiction, powerful yet hidden, generous yet self-serving, connected yet utterly isolated. Within the vast and intricate network that defined Jeffrey Epstein's life, few symbols loomed larger or darker than his private jet, the Boeing 727 that would come to be known around the world as the Lolita Express. Sleek and lavish, it stood as a high-flying symbol of wealth, exclusivity, and power. But beneath the leather seats and polished wood trim, beneath the disguise of luxury, lay a haunting narrative that would later unravel into allegations of abuse, secrecy, and systemic exploitation. Purchased in the early 2000s, the plane was more than a method of transportation. It was a mobile extension of Epstein's world, a place where the elite mingled, deals were whispered, and according to numerous reports, lines of morality and legality were crossed with chilling ease. Inside, the cabin was designed not merely for travel, but for indulgence. Plush seating, a private bedroom, and handcrafted interiors reflected the obscene wealth of its owner. With an estimated net worth exceeding $500 million at the time, Epstein crafted a flying environment that mirrored the aura of his residences. Alluring, exclusive, and, as would later emerge, deeply disturbing. The jet's flight paths traced an elegant, ominous map, gliding between the sunny tarmacs of St. Thomas, New York City, Paris, and other discreet, often undisclosed locations. It was a skyborne salon for politicians, celebrities, royals, and academics. But what happened in the air was often more important than where they landed. Among the passengers were names that would shake the global stage. Bill Clinton's presence aboard the jet was recorded on flight logs more than 24 times between 2001 and 2003, flights he would later describe as connected to philanthropic missions. Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, was also listed among the passengers, his royal status casting an even more dramatic shadow over the aircraft's history. At first glance, these flights could be dismissed as elite travel, but the jet, like so many other components of Epstein's empire, wore a mask. Beneath the glittering exterior were stories far darker. Over time, survivors came forward with harrowing accounts that reframed the jet's legacy entirely. According to their testimonies, the Lolita Express wasn't just a luxury aircraft. It was a tool of trafficking, a vehicle that enabled the movement of victims across borders under the guise of glamour and privacy. What made these allegations even more haunting was how ordinary the luxury appeared. The same leather chairs and tinted windows that once impressed guests became symbols of confinement. The same crew members and flight logs, once mundane, turned into pieces of an investigative puzzle revealing a chilling network of manipulation and abuse. These testimonies painted the jet not as a place of comfort, but of captivity. Public records and legal filings began to piece together this narrative. The jet, once admired as a trophy of the ultra-rich, now represented the most sinister elements of Epstein's power. Mobility without oversight, privilege without restraint, wealth without accountability. While the world marveled at the luxury, few knew of the whispered screams behind the cabin doors. And those who did, many said nothing. As Oscar Wilde once wrote, "The truth is rarely pure and never simple." That truth, slowly, painfully began to surface, exposing a reality where human lives were commodified mid-flight and justice was grounded by power. Today, the name Lolita Express no longer evokes envy or status. It stands as a grim monument, a symbol of how opulence can obscure horror and how, in Epstein's world, even the clouds provided cover. Jeffrey Epstein's real estate holdings were not merely signs of wealth, they were stages. Lavish, opulent, and cloaked in secrecy, each property served as a meticulously curated world, a place where appearances seduced and truth was hidden in plain sight. These were not just homes. They were sanctuaries of silence, built to shield acts that would later haunt public memory. At the center of this real estate web stood Little St. James, a private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, purchased in 1998 for nearly $8 million. A tropical paradise by geography, but by reputation, it would become synonymous with exploitation and secrecy. Covering 70 acres, the island featured not only a grand central villa and luxurious guest houses, but also its own helipad, ensuring complete isolation and controlled access. It was a fortress, far removed from prying eyes and legal oversight. Perhaps the island's most mystifying feature was the blue and white striped temple-like structure, perched atop a hill and shrouded in speculation. Its bizarre appearance sparked countless theories, but one thing was undeniable. Whatever purpose it served, it was meant to stand out and stay locked. This was not a tropical retreat. It was, according to many accounts, a prison of privilege. Survivors would later describe it as a place where nightmares wore the mask of luxury. Here, under the Caribbean sun, trust was manipulated and innocence destroyed. In stark contrast to the island's exotic isolation was Epstein's Manhattan townhouse, located at 9 East 71st Street, one of the most expensive private homes in New York City. Valued at $77 million, this neoclassical mansion, gifted to Epstein by Leslie Wexner, wasn't just imposing from the outside, it was a world unto itself. Inside, the house was a gallery of disturbing eccentricity. A life-sized female doll hung from a chandelier. A custom mural depicted Epstein himself standing in a prison surrounded by barbed wire. A massive portrait of a man in a dress adorned one wall. Each room whispered something deeply unsettling. The mansion was a statement, not just of power, but of control, indulgence, and, as would later become clear, menace. Then there was Zorro Ranch, a sprawling 10,000-acre estate in the desert of New Mexico, acquired in 1993. Remote and expansive, the property featured a nearly 27,000-square-foot residence, private airstrip, and guest facilities designed for total discretion. The vast empty surroundings mirrored Epstein's desire to operate unseen. According to reports, he once shared with associates a disturbing vision: to use the ranch as a hub for selective breeding, where women would bear his children, seeding future generations with his DNA. What began as rumor took on terrifying weight when confirmed by scientists he had spoken to, part of his twisted ambition to leave a genetic legacy behind. Beyond these anchors, Epstein maintained an apartment in Paris on the exclusive Avenue Foch, which served as his European base. His Palm Beach residence in Florida, though smaller in scale, became another critical point in the allegations against him. There, beneath palm trees and behind hedges, acts of cruelty were carried out under the guise of routine massages and social calls. Each property represented more than square footage or market value. They were nodes in a vast network, interconnected through flights, guests, and a code of silence. These homes, though stunning in their architecture, became symbols of something much darker: power used to isolate, control, and exploit. In life, Epstein moved seamlessly between them, disappearing from one and reappearing at another, his locations known only to a few. In death, they remained scattered across the map, silent, guarded, and forever marked by what occurred within their walls. As F. Scott Fitzgerald once reflected, "The beauty and the tragedy of life are intertwined, and we must accept both." But in Epstein's case, beauty was a facade. Behind the gilded gates and polished floors lay a tragedy that the world is only beginning to understand. Beneath the gleam of chandeliers and behind the guarded doors of Jeffrey Epstein's vast residences, a different kind of power gathering took place. Not official summits or political roundtables, but elite soirees that blurred the lines between prestige and secrecy. These were no ordinary dinner parties. They were carefully curated spectacles where the world's most powerful minds and most recognizable faces mingled under the watchful eye of a man who reveled in his role as master of ceremonies. The centerpiece of these gatherings was Epstein's Manhattan mansion on East 71st Street, a 7-story fortress more akin to a private institution than a home. Its walls were adorned not just with expensive artwork, but with unsettling artifacts: a life-size chessboard with pieces modeled after real acquaintances, a mural of Epstein in a prison yard, and a taxidermy collection that unnerved many of his guests. Yet despite, or perhaps because of, these oddities, the mansion became a favored location for gatherings that mingled intellect with affluence. In 2010, Epstein hosted a now infamous dinner party in honor of Prince Andrew, a meeting that years later would unravel into one of the most public royal scandals in modern history. But at the time, it was just another evening at the mansion, lavish, private, and laden with the soft hum of conversation between powerful men. These events were not driven by entertainment. They were strategic, a web of influence spun over fine wine and whispered conversations. Guests included tech titans like Sergey Brin, legal powerhouses like Alan Dershowitz, and real estate moguls such as Mort Zuckerman. They came for reasons known only to themselves and perhaps to Epstein. Each guest, it seemed, served a purpose. To be invited was a statement. You mattered in the world Epstein was shaping. His home on Little St. James Island in the Virgin Islands provided a similarly eerie stage. There, in the humid seclusion of paradise, he convened meetings with academics and scientists to discuss the future of human knowledge, or at least the version of it he wanted to shape. One such moment occurred in 2006 when famed physicist Stephen Hawking visited during a science conference. Surreal images later emerged of the wheelchair-bound genius peering through a remote-controlled submarine, a bizarre visual that symbolized Epstein's uncanny ability to pull even the most esteemed figures into his orbit. These meetings weren't always about science either. At times they veered into unsettling territory. Guests would later recall conversations about eugenics, human cognition, and bizarre personal theories. According to reports, Epstein privately expressed a desire to seed the human race by impregnating multiple women at his New Mexico ranch, a dystopian fantasy that clashed horrifically with the public image of a philanthropist supporting academic research. It became increasingly clear Epstein didn't just collect art or properties. He collected people. He surrounded himself with Nobel laureates, media personalities, and Silicon Valley pioneers, not just to learn from them, but to absorb their influence, to wrap their credibility around his name like armor. Some of those drawn into his circle claimed ignorance. Others distanced themselves quietly, but all were part of the theater. Perhaps the most haunting moments of these gatherings were the contradictions. A former U.S. president playing piano in Epstein's parlor, while rooms upstairs remained sealed. Scientists engaged in conversations, about evolution and ethics while their host contemplated how to manipulate both. For Epstein, these soirees weren't diversions. They were tools. Every handshake, every debate, every guest list was a calculated move on a social chessboard. He wasn't content to live in the shadows. He wanted to own them. In one such gathering, surrounded by minds discussing theoretical physics and neuroscience, Epstein once declared, "I want to understand what it means to be human, and what it means to be alive." But the more we learn about him, the clearer it becomes. His fascination wasn't with humanity, it was with control. What Epstein built behind those doors was not just a social network. It was a mirror of ambition, obsession, and a darkness wrapped in intellectual respectability. And those who accepted his invitations, knowingly or not, became players in a quiet, deeply unsettling game. In the carefully managed world Jeffrey Epstein had built, filled with private jets, fortified mansions, and high-profile guests, the one place he couldn't control was the courtroom. But as the events of 2005 would reveal, even the justice system wasn't immune to the influence of wealth and connections. It began in Palm Beach, Florida, under the warmth of the sun and the false comfort of affluence. A tip led the local police to open an investigation into Epstein's mansion, following allegations that he had been paying underage girls for massages. What began as a single thread quickly unraveled into a disturbing pattern. Behind the gates of his luxurious estate, the truth was far from elegant. Victims described being lured by offers of money, opportunity, and mentorship, only to find themselves caught in a cycle of manipulation and exploitation. Their stories bore chilling similarities. First-time visits turned into repeated abuse, each encounter layered in fear and silence. The Palm Beach Police Department uncovered a pattern so consistent it was impossible to ignore. Girls were recruited from vulnerable backgrounds. They were groomed, paid in cash, and dismissed quietly. And there were many. In 2006, a formal police report recommended multiple charges, including unlawful sexual conduct with minors. It seemed like justice might finally pierce Epstein's protected world. But then came the turning point, a deal that would stain the American legal system for years to come. Instead of facing federal prosecution, in 2008, Epstein entered into a controversial plea agreement brokered by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida. Under the deal, he pleaded guilty to 2 state-level felony charges related to solicitation and was sentenced to 18 months in county jail. On paper, that was a punishment. In reality, it was an escape route. Epstein was granted an almost absurd level of leniency. He was allowed to leave jail 6 days a week for up to 12 hours a day under a work release arrangement. For most of his sentence, he spent more time in his private office than behind bars. He even had access to his private driver. But what stunned the public and legal experts alike was not just the leniency, it was the scope of protection offered. The deal granted immunity to any unnamed co-conspirators, effectively shielding others in Epstein's orbit from prosecution. Even worse, the deal was made without informing the victims, a violation of the Federal Crime Victims' Rights Act. 2. The survivors. This was not justice, it was betrayal. Critics, legal scholars, and media outlets blasted the agreement. It seemed to confirm the worst fears about how the legal system treats the powerful. While victims carried the scars of their trauma, Epstein returned to his life, of wealth, influence, and private jets, his punishment barely a footnote. The architect behind this plea deal was Alexander Acosta, the U.S. attorney at the time, who would later become U.S. Secretary of Labor. His role in the agreement would haunt his political career, eventually leading to his resignation in 2019 under mounting pressure. As Charles Dickens once observed, if there were no bad people, there would be no good lawyers. But in this case, the system itself appeared tilted, justice not only delayed but distorted. The 2008 plea deal became a landmark failure in the public's perception of justice. It exposed how wealth could bend institutions, how victims could be silenced, and how prosecutors could compromise behind closed doors. It was not simply a case of one man avoiding consequences. It was a lesson in how the system could be bent by design. For the survivors, the deal was a second wound, more painful than the first. Their voices had been ignored, their truths buried, beneath legal jargon and sealed agreements. And for Epstein, it became a signal. He had tested the boundaries of the law and found them negotiable. By the summer of 2019, the name Jeffrey Epstein had long been synonymous with scandal and secrecy, whispered in headlines and courtroom transcripts. Yet for years, despite mounting allegations and survivor testimonies, he had managed to live untouched, protected by wealth, cloaked in connections. But that summer, under the scorching July sun, the illusion of invincibility shattered. The catalyst was a series of investigative reports that reignited the fire. Perversion of Justice, a bombshell exposé published by the Miami Herald in November 2018. Journalist Julie K. Brown meticulously documented how Epstein had evaded serious consequences in his 2008 plea deal, and, more importantly, how dozens of alleged victims had never seen justice. The stories were no longer whispers. They were headlines. As James Baldwin once wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And now, at last, Epstein was being faced, by the media, by the courts, and by a public no longer willing to look away. On July 6, 2019, Epstein arrived at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, returning from Paris aboard his private jet. He never made it back home. Federal agents were waiting. His arrest was swift, and for the first time in decades, so was the public reckoning. 2 days later, federal prosecutors unsealed an indictment that detailed new charges: sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. The charges spanned from 2002 to 2005 and focused on his properties in New York and Palm Beach. But this time, the scope was different. The weight of public scrutiny, survivor momentum, and a determined legal team signaled that Epstein's past could no longer be buried beneath settlements and silence. According to the indictment, Epstein had established a system, a calculated, repeated method of luring underage girls to his residences under the guise of massages. Once inside, victims were groomed and exploited. Some were even paid to recruit others. The allegations painted a grim portrait not of a man with occasional misconduct, but of an organized network designed to prey on the vulnerable. The indictment also highlighted something more profound: the bravery of the survivors. Many had come forward over the years only to be silenced, ignored, or discredited. Now they were being heard. In court, the women who once sat in the shadows stood as pillars of strength, facing the man who had robbed them of so much. Their stories were not just evidence. They were acts of defiance. The arrest shook not just the legal world, but the entire social fabric of power. Epstein's connections, presidents, princes, professors, once considered mere gossip, were now subject to renewed scrutiny. Who knew? Who stayed silent? And who might be next? Outside his New York mansion, the media camped for days. Camera crews captured images of FBI agents removing evidence, photos, CDs, files. The building, once a symbol of unreachable luxury, had become the epicenter of a long-overdue investigation. Inside the courtroom, Epstein appeared gaunt but composed. He pleaded not guilty. His legal team predictably pushed for bail, offering a $100 million bond and house arrest in his Upper East Side palace. Prosecutors pushed back, calling him an extraordinary flight risk with a history of obstruction. The judge agreed. He would remain behind bars. The world watched. Social media exploded. And in those tense, uncertain weeks of July, something shifted. This was no longer just about Epstein. It was about the systems that had protected him, the people, the deals, the silence. It was about a culture that had allowed a predator to live in plain sight for decades. As Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." In July 2019, the arc bent a little closer, but justice, true, full justice, was still far away. In the early morning hours of August 10, 2019, inside the sterile walls of the Metropolitan Correctional Center, MCC, in Manhattan, a man who had once moved freely among presidents, billionaires, and scientists was found lifeless in his jail cell. The death of Jeffrey Epstein, at a time when the world finally expected him to face justice, did not bring closure. Instead, it opened a maelstrom of suspicion, anger, and unanswered questions. Only a month earlier, Epstein had been arrested and denied bail. He was now confined to a world that was the stark opposite of the opulence he once ruled. No private jets, no island sanctuaries, no gated mansions. The starkness of his new reality was symbolic, from untouchable to inmate. But Epstein's fall did not end with his arrest. It ended in death and mystery. Officially, his death was ruled a suicide by hanging, but from the outset, that conclusion was met with a wall of disbelief. The circumstances surrounding his death were riddled with irregularities, so many, in fact, that even seasoned observers of the criminal justice system were stunned. To begin with, Epstein had already been placed on suicide watch in late July, after an earlier incident in which he was found injured in his cell. That status, however, was inexplicably downgraded just days later. He was moved to a different cell, one supposedly monitored with regular checks. Yet the 2 guards assigned to watch him allegedly fell asleep and failed to conduct the required 30-minute rounds during the night of his death. To compound the confusion, both surveillance cameras outside his cell reportedly malfunctioned. The footage that might have clarified what happened that night was either missing or unusable. In a facility already known for its deteriorating conditions and chronic understaffing, the timing and nature of these failures fueled an explosion of doubt. Adding to the skepticism was the autopsy report, which stated Epstein died by hanging. But Dr. Michael Baden, a renowned forensic pathologist hired by Epstein's brother, publicly disputed that conclusion. He pointed to multiple fractures in Epstein's neck, particularly the hyoid bone, that he said were more consistent with manual strangulation than suicide. It didn't take long for conspiracy theories to ignite. Some suggested Epstein had been murdered to protect powerful individuals whose secrets he carried. Others theorized he had orchestrated his own death to escape accountability. The fact that he had connections to world leaders, industry titans, and members of royalty only deepened the suspicion. In the days that followed, hashtags like "Nalink Epstein didn't kill himself" trended across the globe. Late-night hosts, politicians, and ordinary citizens demanded answers. What had Epstein known? Who had he threatened to expose? And why, at the most critical moment of his prosecution, was he left so vulnerable? The fallout was swift. Attorney General William Barr declared himself appalled and promised a full investigation. The 2 guards on duty were charged with falsifying records. The director of the Bureau of Prisons was reassigned. And yet, no definitive answers emerged. Then, MCC, once simply a holding facility, became the epicenter of a scandal far larger than one inmate's death. It became a symbol of broken systems, legal, institutional, and moral. The truth remains buried in shadows. Was it incompetence or orchestration? Was Epstein's silence to bury secrets, or was the system so dysfunctional that it simply lost track? Of the most high-profile detainee in recent history, as Arthur Conan Doyle once wrote, "Where there is no imagination, there is no horror." In Epstein's case, imagination rushed in to fill the void left by silence. His death, rather than ending the story, became a labyrinth of questions. Questions still echoed in courtrooms, newsrooms, and the quiet pain of his survivors. In the aftermath, one truth remained unshaken. The pursuit of justice did not die with Jeffrey Epstein. If anything, it burned brighter in the darkness he left behind. Jeffrey Epstein's death may have closed the cell door forever on his testimony, but it did not shut down the pursuit of truth. In fact, it lit a fire. What followed his mysterious end in August 2019 was not quiet resolution, but an urgent and widening quest to expose the full scale of what he built, who enabled it, and who else might have been involved. The Southern District of New York, led by U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Berman at the time, made it unequivocally clear: the case is far from over. Epstein may have been gone, but his network was very much alive and under a microscope. At the center of this new focus was Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's longtime associate, companion, and alleged enabler. For years, her name had been whispered, in the background, cited in survivor accounts and tied to the darkest chapters of Epstein's abuse. But she had disappeared from public view after his arrest and death, until she re-emerged in handcuffs. On July 2, 2020, Maxwell was arrested at a secluded estate in New Hampshire. The charges were explosive: enticement of minors, sex trafficking, and perjury. Prosecutors accused her of helping Epstein groom and abuse underage girls, even participating in the acts herself. No longer a background figure, she had become a central character in the unraveling of Epstein's legacy. Maxwell's arrest triggered a new wave of investigations, lawsuits, and public scrutiny. The legal lens widened, from Epstein and Maxwell to the people, institutions, and financial systems that had orbited them for decades. No longer was the focus just on individuals. It became about the entire infrastructure of silence and complicity. High profile. Names resurfaced in media coverage and court filings. Prince Andrew, already embroiled in controversy, faced renewed pressure. One of Epstein's most vocal accusers, Virginia Giuffre, alleged she had been trafficked to the British Royal while still a teenager. He denied the claims, but the stain was indelible. Other figures in politics, academia, finance, and entertainment distanced themselves or lawyered up as investigators combed through emails, photographs, travel records, and financial transactions. The question was no longer, did Epstein act alone? But rather, who else stood by, or worse, participated? Meanwhile, survivors gained momentum. With Epstein no longer alive to testify or defend himself, their voices became the primary thread of the narrative. Attorneys like Brad Edwards and David Boies fought to ensure that victims' testimonies would not be lost or diluted. In courtrooms and in public, survivors spoke with renewed strength, their silence traded for power. The ripple effects extended to the financial world. Epstein's estate faced mounting legal pressure. In early 2020, Denise George, the Attorney General of the U.S. Virgin Islands, filed a sweeping civil lawsuit seeking to seize assets and properties linked to his alleged criminal enterprise. The complaint claimed Epstein had used a network of shell companies and trusts to facilitate his activities and hide the money trail. Even major banks weren't spared. Deutsche Bank, one of Epstein's former financial institutions, was fined $150 million for compliance failures tied to their relationship with him. The fine was not just punitive, it was symbolic. Institutions that had once profited from his business were now being held accountable. Each of these legal actions, public statements, and financial penalties contributed to something larger: a cultural shift. No longer could reputations shield individuals from accountability. No longer could systems turn a blind eye under the weight of donations or prestige. The Epstein saga exposed just how deep and resilient power networks can be, but also how determined truth seekers can become. As investigations deepened, new victims came forward, new documents were unsealed, and the promise that no one is above the law was put to the test. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., so often quoted in moments of reckoning, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. In the aftermath of Epstein's death, that arc didn't just bend, it tightened around those who had once stood above consequence. In the shadow of Jeffrey Epstein's empire, there are voices that refuse to fade. They belong to the women, many, once young girls who emerged from trauma not only scarred but resolute. Their stories, once dismissed or ignored, now form the most powerful legacy of truth in the wake of Epstein's crimes. They are not just witnesses, they are survivors. Among the most widely recognized is Virginia Giuffre, whose journey from silence to defiance reshaped public understanding of Epstein's abuse network. Her nightmare began in the early 2000s when she was working at Mar-a-Lago, where she met Ghislaine Maxwell, a meeting she now recalls as the first step into darkness. Giuffre alleges she was trafficked to Epstein and his powerful associates, including Prince Andrew, a claim that set off a global media storm. While the prince denies the allegations, The impact of her voice cannot be denied. I will not be silenced. I will not be intimidated. Jeffrey's declaration became a rallying cry for survivors everywhere. Another voice, equally searing in its honesty, is that of Sarah Ransom. In 2007, she escaped from Epstein's private island, Little St. James, a place she described not as paradise but as a gilded cage. Originally promised educational opportunities, Ransom found herself trapped in a world where manipulation was masked as generosity. Her courage in fleeing and later testifying helped shine a light on the mechanisms Epstein used to control and isolate victims. I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it, Ransom later quoted, echoing Maya Angelou and reinforcing the defiant strength that now defines her. Annie Farmer's story adds another chilling layer to the mosaic. Lured under the pretense of academic mentorship, she traveled to Epstein's New Mexico ranch, a site she believed would offer opportunity and growth. Instead, she encountered exploitation masked as kindness. Her decision to testify publicly years later was not just about confronting Epstein, but about reclaiming her story from a system that had overlooked her for too long. Her voice in court, steady and unwavering, was a living reminder that justice delayed doesn't have to be justice denied. Annie's sister, Maria Farmer, was one of the earliest to report Epstein to the FBI in 1996. Her warnings went unheeded for years, but she didn't stop. Through her art and activism, Maria created visual memorials of survivors' faces, an act of remembrance, of witness, of resistance. Her quiet but persistent defiance is a reminder that sometimes the first voices are the most easily ignored, but the most important to hear. These women, and many others whose names remain private, share more than trauma. They share a relentless pursuit of justice, often in the face of disbelief, legal intimidation, and media scrutiny. Their bravery has rewritten the public narrative, shifting the spotlight from Epstein's connections to the consequences of his crimes. They also revealed something deeper: how society for years had allowed predators like Epstein to flourish. The systems that should have protected them, the law, the courts, the press, had often failed. But in the survivors' persistence, those same systems were forced to change. As Elie Wiesel once said, we must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. In raising their voices, these survivors chose sides, and in doing so, they shattered the silence. Their testimonies are not just personal recollections. They are calls to action. They remind us that justice is not only about punishment, it's about recognition, about telling the truth even when no one wants to hear it. Epstein may be gone, but the survivors remain, and their strength, their clarity, and their unbreakable will stand as the true reckoning. Among the many remnants of Jeffrey Epstein's hidden world, few artifacts have sparked as much fascination and dread as his black book. A simple-looking address book that once exposed read like a who's who of global power, wealth, and celebrity. But this was not just a Rolodex. It was a mirror reflecting the vast reach of a man who curated influence with surgical precision. With over 1,000 names and hundreds of contact numbers, the book became a central piece of evidence, a chilling artifact that suggested Epstein's web stretched across continents, industries, and ideologies. What was once private now whispered publicly about the double lives of the elite. Among the names were former presidents, royalty, Hollywood celebrities, Wall Street tycoons, academics, and media moguls. Not merely acquaintances, many were frequent guests on Epstein's jet, visitors to his properties, or listed with multiple phone numbers and detailed instructions, a sign of close, sustained contact. Donald Trump, once a real estate tycoon and later president, appeared in the book, hinting at their long and complex history. Bill Clinton was also listed, his name already the subject of scrutiny due to flight logs connecting him to Epstein's infamous jet. One entry included over 21 different contact methods for Clinton, suggesting a level of familiarity that deepened public suspicion. Then came Prince Andrew, whose ties to Epstein had already spiraled into scandal. His appearance in the book further solidified questions about how deep those connections truly ran. But it wasn't just the high-profile political figures. The names of businessmen like Leslie Wexner, the billionaire retail magnate, Glenn Dubin, a hedge fund founder, and academics like Marvin Minsky and Lawrence Krauss pointed to Epstein's calculated cultivation of intellectual and financial power. This was not a casual contact list. It was a blueprint of access, a map of leverage, a constellation of people, across industries, law, science, media, and politics, all orbiting a man who was supposed to be an outsider, but who clearly was not. Some names raised eyebrows simply by association. Others caused reputational earthquakes. Alongside the entries were notations, assistant names, secret numbers, alternate addresses, details only an insider would have. The deeper one went into the book, the more it became clear. Epstein didn't just know people. He knew how to reach them, how to contact them at home, at work, through their staff, or through private lines. The book also revealed the intimate logistics of Epstein's social machine. Who attended which events, who flew where, and who stayed silent. One particularly revealing entry referenced a now infamous 2010 dinner party at Epstein's New York mansion. The guest list included Katie Couric, Charlie Rose, and Woody Allen, all dining together in the same space that would later be described by law enforcement as a den of secrecy, decadence, and manipulation. These dinners were more than social affairs. They were strategic alliances, disguised as elegance. In the wake of its publication, the Black Book became a cultural flashpoint. For some, it confirmed long-held suspicions about the hypocrisy of the elite. For others, it opened an uncomfortable window into the complicity of silence. Public reaction was immediate and divided. Some claimed innocence, I barely knew him. Others denied contact outright. But the ink on the pages told a different story. As Gloria Steinem once said, "The truth will set you free, but first, it will piss you off." That truth, etched in Epstein's Black Book, didn't just illuminate who was connected. It begged the deeper question, what did they know, and when did they know it? The answers may never be fully known, but the book remains, a relic not of friendship, but of proximity to a man who weaponized access and turned influence into insulation, a small object, a heavy legacy. Long after the courtroom battles quieted and the news cameras moved on, the story of Jeffrey Epstein did not vanish. It seeped into the fabric of popular culture, finding form in documentaries, books, podcasts, fictional portrayals, and artistic expressions. His saga, part real-life horror, part cautionary tale, became a mirror reflecting society's uncomfortable truths about power, corruption, and the cost of silence. On television screens, the story took center stage with the 2020 Netflix documentary, series Jeffrey Epstein, Filthy Rich. Directed by Lisa Bryant and produced by Joe Berlinger, the series peeled back layers of luxury and exposed the systematic abuse that had long hidden in plain sight. Through first-hand survivor accounts and legal commentary, the series transformed public perception. Epstein was no longer just a mysterious financier. He was the architect of a predatory network. Virginia Giuffre, one of the most outspoken survivors, declared in the series, "The monsters are still out there and they're still hurting people." That single sentence became the haunting refrain of the entire documentary movement. Books followed with blistering detail. Relentless Pursuit by Bradley Edwards, one of the attorneys representing several victims, provided a gripping insider's account of the legal battles waged against Epstein. The memoir took readers from Florida courtrooms to Manhattan mansions, showing just how high the stakes were and how hard it was to penetrate the shield Epstein had built around himself. Another critical title, Perversion of Justice, expanded on the investigative work that reignited Epstein's downfall. These books weren't just page-turners, they were case files, placing the reader in the center of one of the most complex and disturbing legal sagas in recent history. Meanwhile, television crime dramas began weaving thinly veiled references into their scripts. Law and Order, Special Victims Unit aired episodes inspired by Epstein's crimes, including one titled Flight, which centered on a wealthy man with a private jet, a trail of abuse allegations, and high-level protection. The fictional portrayal blurred lines with reality, echoing exactly how Epstein had thrived in both worlds. In the digital realm, podcasts became deep dives into his empire of silence. Broken, Jeffrey Epstein by Ariel Levy dissected the network of power that shielded him, while Epstein, Devil in the Darkness, explored the philosophical and psychological layers of the case. These weren't just narratives, they were auditory investigations, piecing together transcripts, survivor accounts, and courtroom strategies for global audiences. Even artists and photographers engaged with the story. In a 2020 gallery exhibit in New York, one anonymous artist juxtaposed high-gloss images of Epstein's properties with grim visuals of prison cells, a haunting contrast between wealth and justice. The message was unspoken but thunderous. Behind every polished marble floor might lie the silence of unseen victims. Across all mediums, one theme remained constant. Epstein's story was not just about him. It was about us. About how society lionizes wealth, excuses the powerful, and questions victims more than perpetrators. His rise was enabled not by genius but by compliance. His silence bought not with fear, but with influence. Through popular culture, the world began to ask new questions. How many Epsteins are still protected? How many victims are still unheard? And most importantly, what will we do when the next monster hides behind a golden gate? As Winston Churchill once said, "The truth is incontrovertible. Malice may attack it, ignorance may deride it, but in the end, there it is." The truth in Epstein's case has not only come to light, it now echoes endlessly across screens, pages, and canvases. The story isn't over, not for the survivors, not for the world, and not for the culture that helped create him.